Welcome to this presentation on screening for dyslexia in Massachusetts. This presentation is a collaboration of the Chris Walsh Center and Massachusetts Decoding Dyslexia. I'm Nancy Duggan, and I'm the Executive Director of Decoding Dyslexia Massachusetts. Today, we're going to start with what is dyslexia. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurological in origin. The difficulties that impact accurate and fluent word reading are the difficulties of dyslexia. You can learn more about dyslexia from the National Center for Improving Literacy, the International Dyslexia Association, and a prior Chris Walsh Center video on understanding dyslexia. Also, there is a Massachusetts dyslexia guideline. Please follow the link, print a copy, and have it for your reference. Why is dyslexia screening important? We know from research that early identification of dyslexia allows for early instruction. Even though students are in classrooms learning about reading with their same-age peers, if they are not receiving the intervention they need for early access to learning to read, then they fall behind their peers. Once students fall behind, it's more difficult to intervene and help them catch up. But what does that really look like? In Massachusetts, statistically, there's a delay. Usually, when students are learning to read from the K through 2 grades, we see very few students receiving intervention for special education and for dyslexia. Instead, most students with dyslexia are not identified until they've fallen further behind their peers. This is called the wait to fail model. Screening is intended to stop that wait to fail model. Screening is developmentally appropriate. Early skills that are used to learn to read, from sound and language processing, visual processing, phonological processing, letter name knowledge, grapheme phoneme mapping, all these skills develop in children early. And the best time for intervention is in these early years. When we wait for the later years, when all their peers are doing word reading and reading in sentences in connected text and reading complex text, then those students are behind. The optimal time for effective intervention is early, from grades K through 3. It is more difficult and more time-consuming if we don't identify the signs of dyslexia early. Without appropriate instruction in the general class and an intervention, screening will not change outcomes. So not only do we need to understand screening, we need to understand that no child is born to read. Reading is learned. Students alter their brains through learning. Brain cells that were designed for vision and hearing and linguistic meaning, they're recycled or adapted. Those same brain cells learn new jobs. And that's how we learn to read, by associating the skills for reading and developing those pathways throughout the brain and connect them. So pathways throughout the brain are connecting visual processing, auditory processing, and language processing skills to build a reading network in the brain. We don't need to understand the brain science to understand that earlier intervention helps students. The gap gets larger and more difficult without specific intervention and evidence-based methods proven to help students with dyslexia. If students are struggling along in a typical path without proper intervention, they will get further behind their peers. So while a first grader might be slightly behind peers, and that might show up in screening, if we don't do the right intervention, by 3rd grade, that child will be further behind their peers because typical students develop and progress exponentially, improving their reading skill. Screening is effective. There are a lot of myths about early screening for dyslexia. Lots of people think that screening for dyslexia or signs can only be seen after reading instruction after a child fails. But as we just saw, the most optimal time for intervention is early. Another myth is the second language learners cannot be screened for dyslexia until they're fluent in English. This is not true. Dyslexia affects all students, regardless of their natural or home language, even bilingual students. In every language, in every culture, we can find dyslexia. Even if you screen early, you won't be able to intervene effectively. This is also an important myth. As we saw from the prior slides, early intervention is the most effective and efficient and even the most cost-saving way to help students with dyslexia. There's also a myth that children will grow out of it if we just wait, give them some time. It's not their time, give them time, they need to catch up. Everybody learns at a different pace. This is not true. Students will not outgrow dyslexia. In fact, even students who learn to read they still have persistent signs of dyslexia in adulthood. Students with dyslexia can learn to read and should learn to read at the same time as their peers. Screening can only be completed by neuropsychologists. This is not true. Certainly, a neuropsychological evaluation will provide concrete and diagnostic assessment of a child's strengths and weaknesses, including a diagnosis for dyslexia. But screening and identifying dyslexia does not require a neuropsychologist. Screening is a quick and efficient process to find students who are at risk for dyslexia and to begin the process of monitoring and providing intervention so that they do not wait to fail. We'll learn more about this as we go forward. What are the legal obligations of screening? There are federal obligations and state obligations. Let's talk first about the federal obligations. Every Student Succeeds Act is often called ESSA. And although in my tiny little image, you can't read all the details, we can see that in Section 8, the federal requirement for ESSA is that valid and reliable screening assessments for reading are taking place, and that includes dyslexia. Section 8 is also saying that students' needs, including special education needs, should be screened. IDEA law is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and Section 300.34, Related Services, calls for early identification of all disabilities, including dyslexia, and it requires a formal plan. Take a look at this slide. Early identification of disabilities in children needs to be implemented in a formal plan for identifying a disability as early as possible in a child's life. Research has shown in the past 15 years that early identification of dyslexia is possible and easily done with good screening. Early identification is important under IDEA law, and so adjustments in school policies need to be clear. Parents should ask to see the school policy, the formal plan for identifying students with dyslexia. A formal plan helps parents and districts ensure that all students are identified early. None of these laws are new. They've been in effect since 2015 and before. The legal obligations under federal law are complex, but these are some of the highlights of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There's the child find, which means the districts need to identify and locate all children with disabilities birth to 21. Districts must have a method of determining which children with disabilities are receiving special education and related services and which children are not. Let's think about that. If they need to tell which children with disabilities are or are not having services, that means they need to identify them. Even if children are not receiving special education services, we need to identify those students early. The IDEA law covers students who attend private or public schools. highly mobile children, migrant children, homeless children, and children who are wards of the state. There are no exceptions for child find. So the policies and procedures, the formal plan that your district has should include all students, even students in private school, even students who are homeless and students who are wards of the state. The mandate applies to all children who are suspected of having a disability, including children who receive passing grades and are advancing from grade to grade. Some students may or may not receive services, but they must be identified, including students who are advancing from grade to grade. Massachusetts has its own legal obligations above and beyond the federal. Many federal laws are reflected in Massachusetts law, and they sort of mirror each other. So the Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 71B, Section 3, is covering sort of child find or IDEA law in the Massachusetts view. And this law says that the district, every town or school district, will identify the school-age children who have a disability. There is no exception here for dyslexia. And dyslexia is identifiable as early as age 5. Massachusetts requires diagnosis and evaluating the needs of such children. So if a child is suspected of a disability, they need to have a plan to diagnose and evaluate the needs of those children. So your district should have a plan and a protocol for students who are at risk for dyslexia to find their diagnosis if it's needed. In 2018, Massachusetts passed another screening law. So this prior law, this existed well before 2018. Massachusetts has always had the ability to say dyslexia. It's always had the ability to identify and the obligation to evaluate the needs of children and diagnose the needs of children with dyslexia. There's never been a legal reason why a school could not use the word dyslexia. But now, since 2018, Massachusetts screening law has been in place. This is an amended law to the current screening laws that include vision and hearing and posture and other health issues that Massachusetts regularly screens for students in schools. Like other mandates in Chapter 57, vision and things like that, local districts need a plan to comply with federal and state law for screening dyslexia. Additionally, in this law, in the additional Chapter 57A for dyslexia screening, the state legislature asked the Department of Education, DESE is the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and they were required to also assist the districts in developing these screening plans. So the districts are required to have protocols and plans to identify dyslexia. That was already part of the law. But in 2018, dyslexia screening guidance was begun by the state. So that DESE, or the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, created some guidelines. Further regulation was recently approved in Massachusetts in September 2022. In addition to the current federal state obligations for screening protocols to identify students with dyslexia, Massachusetts will now require specific screening tools approved by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education starting in September 2023. So before this regulation goes into effect, districts still must have a protocol and screening for dyslexia that's valid and reliable. But going forward, that protocol will have to include specific screening tools the department has approved of. The new regulation also mentions in the regulation that screening is in line with 71B Section 3. That's the section I just showed you about Massachusetts having a process to identify all students, including dyslexia, all disabilities, sorry, including dyslexia, and a way to diagnose and evaluate the needs of those children. What can you do as parents or educators to recognize good screening and to follow up? Good screening meets the research standards of ESSA and IDEA for valid and reliable peer-reviewed research. Those are the laws and obligations I pointed out earlier. These same laws have standards for peer-reviewed research that's evidence-based. Good screening is fast, efficient, and based on research measures, and it measures the key indicators of dyslexia, which are phonemic awareness, naming speed, or also called RAN, rapid automatized naming, and letter sound knowledge. Ask your school district for the written clear policy for identifying dyslexia. What screening assessments are used? What diagnostic assessments are used? Is the information available to all parents and educators? What can you do to recognize good screening and follow up? You can use our Decoding Dyslexia Parent Toolkit to understand what screening is being used and how to follow up. This handout is attached in a link so that you can use it. It talks about very specific questions you can ask about your screening. It provides a parent workshop to talk about other things that might impact reading and to keep track of family history. And it also provides you with some questions and answers that you might find helpful as you go through the process of learning more about your child's dyslexia screening in your district. Good screening is also clearly identified in the Massachusetts guidance. So this is just the front cover of a 79-page, I think it's 79 pages, PDF document that Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has provided to parents and educators. It's an excellent guide, and I recommend that every parent download it. This is a copy of the 2015 dyslexia guidance that the federal government provided in what we call a Dear Colleague letter from the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services. This letter is a 4-page letter. I just have a small piece of it here, but you can go to the link and download all 4 pages. One of the most important messages in this federal guidance is that there has never been a reason not to use the term dyslexia, dyscalculia, or dysgraphia, or any other of the SLD disabilities in your child's IEP. There's no reason that schools need to avoid those terms. And in fact, it later says that the terminology is important for finding the appropriate intervention to meet the child's needs. Finally, in this 4-page guidance, it references that the MTSS system, which is called the multi-tiered system of supports, cannot be used to delay or deny services for a student who has a disability. So going from screening and risk to finding a diagnosis for some children can be urgent and not need to wait for intervention through MTSS. At any time, a parent can request a full evaluation for special education services. Screening cannot be used to delay or require general MTSS intervention if a parent requests an evaluation. Screening does not delay or override IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, parent rights, or district obligations for the child find services we spoke about earlier in this presentation. Screening is meant to be as early as kindergarten, and if you suspect dyslexia or any other learning disability for students in grade 1 or beyond, request an evaluation, because as we saw before, waiting to fail is not a good option for our students, and it's not the plan for effective success of all students. How would you request a full evaluation? This slide provides an example of a request that you can send in an email. Requesting an evaluation is a legal process that any parent is entitled to. It's your right. You can write to the administrator and request all of these particularly specific to reading. Please assess all areas of suspected disability, including phonological processing. That's a key indicator of dyslexia. expressive and receptive language. Language areas can show dyslexia and other learning disabilities that will impact reading. Spelling and cognitive ability. Spelling and cognitive ability are both accurate measures to help us understand how a student is impacted and their learning needs. A full assessment to determine strengths and challenges impacting reading and writing. So reading and writing are reciprocal. So if you're interested in reading, you should also request evaluations in writing. Parents have a right to be informed of the assessments and what those assessments will be testing. It's called informed consent. So you can expect a document that will list all the tests and explain each area of evaluation. Which tests will be testing phonological processing? Which test will be testing writing? Which test will be testing speech and language or vocabulary abilities? You can also expect that a diagnosis will be considered and provided if your child has a disability as required by Massachusetts Law 71B, Section 3. So this is a polite request that you can use. An important thing for parents to know is that as soon as you put this request, it sets sort of like a clock ticking and the calendar begins. After receiving this request, your district has 5 business days to provide you with that document of informed consent. Once you sign the informed consent, within 45 school days from the signed consent, a team will have a meeting to discuss all the evaluations and assessments that they have provided. So with about only, there's plenty more school days than 45 or 50. So don't wait though till the end of the year. If there's only about 45 or 50 days left after March, waiting will mean you won't get your evaluation until the next year. So you want to give the school time to be able to provide that in the same school year so that it can be acted upon. Thank you for letting me shine a light on dyslexia screening. If you have additional questions, you can follow us on our Facebook page for Decoding Dyslexia Massachusetts. We also have a group on Facebook where you can ask questions to other parents called the Decoding Dyslexia Massachusetts Facebook group. Or you can also contact me at iepreadinggoals@gmail.com. No part of this presentation is intended as legal counsel or advice. Thank you.